Prison food in Rikers Island, meals in the world's harshest prison. The tray that changed everything. The metal door slammed open. A correction officer pushed a food tray through the slot, and the entire dorm went silent. The smell hit first, a thick, rotten odor that made the inmates step back. On the tray sat a small scoop of gray, mushy meat, a slice of stale bread, and juice that looked like dirty water. Then suddenly, bam! An inmate named Rico kicked his bunk and shouted, "I ain't eating that. That's not food." Everyone froze. In Rikers, reacting like that can bring trouble fast. A guard outside yelled, "Keep it down." But Rico held the tray in his hand, staring at it like it was poison. And right there, the room changed. Guys started whispering, arguing, holding their own trays. Some were angry. Some were scared. Some were just tired of eating food they felt wasn't meant for humans. One thought ran through the dorm. If this is today's meal, what will tomorrow be like? And that moment, that fear, that tension, is where this story begins. Welcome to Rikers, where the food tells the truth. Rikers Island is not just a jail, it's a different world. Most inmates are waiting for trial, stressed, hungry, and confused. And the food? The food becomes a message. A warning. Test of how strong you are. Every morning at 5 a.m., the first trays roll in. You don't wake up because you're ready for the day. You wake up because an officer is shouting, "Breakfast trays. Get up." Then you sit on your bunk, half asleep, staring at a tray with a small scoop of watery oatmeal, a piece of cornbread so dry it crumbles, and sometimes a boiled egg that smells off. Some inmates eat it. Some just stare at it. Some give it away. But everyone, no matter who they are, gang members, first-time offenders, teenagers, older men, they all feel the same thing: hunger and disappointment. Because in Rikers, meals are not meals. They're survival tests. By lunchtime, things get harder. Lunch trays come with a mix of peanut butter sandwiches, mystery meat patties, cold, soggy noodles, or bologna slices stuck together. Sometimes you find hair in the food. Sometimes the food is still frozen in the middle. And when inmates complain, officers usually say, "Eat it or don't." But the thing about hunger is this: when you're starving, even bad food becomes a tough choice. Then comes dinner, the meal everyone waits for. Dinner is supposed to be the best meal, but even then it might be rice cooked into a wet lump, beans that taste burnt, chicken that's either too pink or too hard to chew, vegetables boiled until they turn to mush. Some inmates keep the good parts and trade them. Some create jail recipes to make things taste better. Others throw the meal away and go hungry. Everything depends on the tray. Every day, the tray decides who stays calm and who snaps under pressure. And that's why the smell from Rico's tray triggered something dangerous in the dorm. Because in Rikers, food is more than food. It's anger. It's power. It's control. Sometimes, it's the spark for something bigger. The kitchen behind the chaos. To understand why the trays look the way they do, you have to understand where they come from, the Rikers kitchen. Most people never see it, but it decides everything inmates eat. Inside the kitchen, the day starts before sunrise. Massive pots boil on industrial stoves. Trays are stacked in tall metal racks. And workers, mostly inmates, move fast, trying to prepare thousands of meals with barely any time. But here's the truth most people don't know. The kitchen is not built for perfection. It's built for speed. And speed creates mistakes. The food comes in big frozen blocks. Sometimes the meat is still icy when it hits the pan. Sometimes vegetables are mixed from leftover batches. If one batch burns a little, it still gets served. The cooks are not trained chefs. They're inmates simply assigned to work the line. Some care. Some don't. Some just want to get through their shift without trouble. One inmate chef named Tito told the new guys, "Don't ask me what this meat is. I don't know. I just cook it." He wasn't joking. Most items come labeled with codes instead of names. Boxes read things like poultry product or processed protein item. No one really knows what's inside. They just heat it, slice it, and drop it on trays. And the worst part? The food sits for hours before it even reaches the units. First it's cooked. Then it's loaded onto carts. Then it's rolled through long hallways. Then it's delivered to each building. Then it's handed out one tray at a time. By the time inmates get it, the food is often sticky, overcooked, undercooked, or simply unrecognizable. And that's how a normal day becomes a dangerous one. Because when people are stressed, scared, and hungry, a bad meal can feel like an insult, an attack, a sign that nobody cares. That's exactly what pushed Rico to the edge. When the officer delivered that smelly tray, Rico felt like he had finally reached his limit. But he wasn't the only one. Other inmates began checking their trays too. Why is my meat raw? This ain't cooked. This bread is moldy. What's that smell? Whispers grew louder. Voices rose. A few guys stood up. The officer saw all of this happening and stepped closer to the door. His hand slid slowly toward his radio. He knew the signs. A food-based disturbance was brewing. In Rikers, food can start fights. Food can start riots. Food can turn one bad tray into a dorm-wide meltdown. And everyone knew this was heading in a dangerous direction. When hunger turns into tension, the dorm was now buzzing like a shaken beehive. It started with Rico's tray, but it didn't stay with Rico. Hunger is powerful. And inside Rikers, hunger mixes with stress, fear, anger, and boredom, the perfect recipe for trouble. One inmate named Dre held up his tray and shouted, "This is what they feed us? For real?" Another guy, Malik, sniffed his food and put it down instantly. "Smells like it died twice," he muttered. Others just stared at their trays with a tired, hopeless look. Because in Rikers, complaining rarely changes anything. But when everyone complains at the same time, that's when officers get nervous. The correction officer at the door kept scanning the room. His voice was firm when he said, "Sit down. Eat your meal. Let's keep it peaceful in here." But the inmates weren't listening anymore. Someone in the back yelled, "We're not animals. Why we getting food like this?" Another added, "Y'all don't care if we get sick." And then, something small but explosive happened. An inmate lifted his tray and let it slip from his hands. Splat. Food hit the floor. The entire dorm went dead silent. Was it an accident? Was it on purpose? Did it matter? The officer stepped forward. His hand grabbed his radio. He spoke into it quietly but urgently. "Control, we may have a situation in Dorm 4C. Stand by." Around the room, inmates exchanged looks. Rico clenched his jaw. Dre cracked his knuckles. Others stood up slowly, testing the officer's reaction. Because in Rikers, everything is a balance. How far can inmates push back? How much will the officers allow? Will this turn into a fight? Or will someone step in and calm the storm? The officer repeated, "Everybody sit down." But nobody moved. Not because they wanted trouble, but because frustration had finally boiled over. This wasn't just about food. It was about respect. It was about survival. And then, a voice from the corner broke the tension. A calm, older inmate named Boston stood up and said, "Yo, listen, y'all gonna get us in lockdown for days. Chill." Some inmates listened. Some didn't. But Boston wasn't finished. He walked slowly toward Rico and said, "Bro, the food is trash, we all know that. But if this turns into chaos, they win. We lose." Rico looked torn, anger on one side, reason on the other. Still, the room was seconds away from exploding. Everyone held their breath. Every eye turned toward Rico. What he did next would decide everything. Peace, or a full-blown incident. The moment that could break the dorm. The air felt heavy, like the whole room was holding one single breath. Rico stood there, tray in hand, shaking with frustration. Not from fear, but from everything he'd been holding inside for weeks. Sleepless nights, cold meals, endless noise, tension with officers, and the constant feeling that nobody cared. His eyes locked on the officer at the door. The officer stared back, tense, waiting for a single wrong move. Boston stood beside Rico, calm but alert. "Think, brother," he whispered. "You throw that tray? We all go down. The entire dorm leaned forward, waiting. Rico tightened his grip. His knuckles turned white. The officer spoke again, louder now. Do not make a bad decision. But in Rikers, decisions aren't always about right or wrong. Sometimes they're about survival. Sometimes pride. Sometimes the pressure becomes too heavy to hold. Rico finally exhaled and said, I'm tired, man. I'm tired of eating like this. He didn't shout. He didn't scream. He just said it quietly, and somehow, that silence hit harder than a yell. Boston nodded. We know. But don't let them use this against us. A few inmates murmured. He right. Chill, bro. Not worth it. But then, a loud bang echoed from the hallway. Another officer had slammed the outer gate open. 3 more officers stood behind him, ready to enter if things went bad. Now the inmates realized something. They were outnumbered. And Rikers officers don't play when it comes to food disturbances. Rico looked at the backup arriving. He looked at his dorm mates. He looked at the tray. Finally, he lowered it. He didn't throw it. He didn't drop it. He just set it down on the nearest bunk. The officer didn't relax, not yet, but he eased his hand away from his radio. The room let out a slow breath, like the danger had finally passed. But the moment wasn't over. Dre lifted his voice from across the room. If they want peace, give us real food. Another inmate added, yeah. Why we getting cold trays every day? This time, instead of anger, there was unity. Not violence. Not chaos. Just voices finally speaking up. The officer responded, I'll report the issue to the kitchen. That's all I can do. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't disrespectful. He was just tired too. Rikers wears everyone down, inmates and officers. Rico sat back on his bunk. His tray still looked disgusting. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. The whole dorm had felt the same thing. But the story wasn't finished. Because later that night, when everyone thought the day was over, something new happened in the kitchen. Something that would send a different kind of tray to the dorm the next morning. The tray no one expected. That night, the dorm finally settled down. Lights dimmed. Inmates whispered from bunk to bunk. Some played cards. Some stared at the ceiling, hungry but too tired to care. Rico lay on his mattress, thinking about the tray, thinking about how close everything came to exploding. But while the dorm slept, something unusual was happening on the other side of Rikers Island, inside the kitchen. The kitchen shift that changed everything. The night kitchen crew had already heard about the food incident in Dorm 4C. Word travels fast in Rikers. A correction officer walked into the kitchen and spoke to the inmate workers. 4C complained about trays. Make sure breakfast tomorrow is clean. The crew didn't argue. They just nodded and got to work. Tito, the inmate cook who'd been working kitchen shifts for months, shook his head and said, Man, every time a dorm complains, we gotta fix everything overnight. But secretly, he didn't mind. If the dorm got better food, it meant less tension. Less drama. Less yelling. And everyone, even kitchen workers, wanted that. They thawed out fresher products. They cleaned the pans twice. They made sure the oatmeal wasn't watery. They even picked through the bread to avoid the stale pieces. The officers overseeing the shift didn't say much. They just watched, making sure the food came out right. By 4:30 a.m., the trays were stacked neatly. Hot oatmeal. 2 slices of decent bread. A fresh apple. And a carton of regular milk, not expired this time. Was it 5-star food? But compared to yesterday's disaster, it was a miracle. Tito wiped his forehead and said, This one won't start a riot. Hopefully. The delivery. When the morning officers rolled the food carts into Dorm 4C, inmates lifted their heads immediately. Everyone remembered the chaos from yesterday. The officers shouted, Breakfast incoming. Line up. There was tension again, but a different kind. More like curiosity. Rico stood up slowly. Dre rubbed his eyes. Boston sat up on his bunk, watching. When the trays were handed out, inmates opened them cautiously. And then the entire room reacted the same way. Yo, this looks way better. The oatmeal was steaming hot. The bread wasn't rock hard. The apple was still green and shiny. The milk wasn't sour. For a moment, there was actual silence. Then Rico said, "Ayo, who cooked today? Gordon Ramsay?" The whole dorm laughed, not loud chaos but real laughter. The kind inmates don't get many chances to feel. Even the officer cracked a tiny smile. But the story doesn't end there. Because while breakfast was better that morning, something else was happening in the background, something inmates didn't see. The kitchen supervisor had filed a report. The officers on duty had filed another. And those reports were moving up the chain of command. Someone higher up was asking questions. Why did the food go bad yesterday? Who handled the trays? Was the storage working right? Were inmates getting meals that could make them sick? Something big was brewing. Not in the dorm. Not with the inmates. But inside the system itself. And soon, the truth behind Rikers Island food, the real truth, would be exposed. The report that shook the island. While Dorm 4C enjoyed their improved breakfast, something serious was happening far from the inmates, inside the administration building of Rikers Island. 2 reports had landed on a supervisor's desk before sunrise. A complaint about spoiled trays in Dorm 4C. A near disturbance caused by food quality. The supervisor, Officer Reynolds, tapped the papers on his desk and sighed. Food complaints weren't new, they came in often. But this one? This one was different. It mentioned a foul smell coming from the meat. Multiple trays rejected by inmates. Signs of rising tension. Officers needing backup on standby. Reynolds knew that if something wasn't fixed, food could trigger a bigger problem the next time. So he went straight to the kitchen to find answers. The inspection. When the kitchen doors opened, the workers stiffened. They knew an inspection meant trouble. Reynolds walked in with a clipboard and gloves. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just started checking. Storage temperatures. Food expiration dates. Freezers. Prep tables. The bins where old meals were thrown away. Tito, the inmate cook, whispered to the others. Act normal. Keep working. Don't make him look too close. But Reynolds was already looking closely. He opened a freezer and stopped. Inside, he found several boxes of processed protein blend with expiration stickers that looked suspicious. Some were faded. Some had handwritten dates. Some looked like they were relabeled. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Then he checked the refrigerator. More boxes. Some items looked fine. Others were borderline spoiled. He took notes silently. The officers in the kitchen exchanged nervous glances. Everyone knew what this meant. Someone had been cutting corners. And now the higher-ups were about to find out. The real problem. Reynolds asked Tito, "Who handled the meat yesterday?" Tito swallowed. Different guys on different shifts. I don't know who messed it up." Reynolds took another note. Then he asked a tougher question. "When was the last time this place passed a full sanitation check?" The room froze. No one answered. And silence was the answer. Reynolds breathed out slowly. He wasn't angry, just disappointed. He finally said, "If this kitchen doesn't get fixed, the chaos won't happen here. It'll happen out there in the housing units. And nobody wants that." Everyone knew he was right. Food in a jail isn't just food. It affects food, behavior, tension, safety. Bad meals can start fights. Better meals can keep the peace. Rikers Island was already under pressure from public scrutiny, news reports, and overcrowding. The last thing they needed was food becoming another disaster. Back in the dorm. While all this was happening, Dorm 4C was having one of its calmest breakfasts in weeks. Rico took a bite and nodded. "Aight, this ain't bad today." Dre raised his apple and said, "Cheers, boys. Today we eat like kings." Boston smiled quietly. He didn't celebrate, but he was relieved. Even the officers felt the shift. The energy was different, lighter. But the peace wouldn't last long. Because when the kitchen investigation officially started, people began pointing fingers. Supervisors asked for logs. Officers were questioned. Inmate workers were interviewed. A storm was forming behind the scenes. And when storms form in Rikers Island, they always reach the housing units eventually. The question wasn't if the inmates would feel the impact. The question was when. When the truth reaches the dorm. For the rest of the morning, Dorm 4C felt unusually calm. Guys were talking, laughing, even relaxing, something rare inside Rikers Island. But peace in jail never lasts. Not when an investigation is happening behind the scenes. By lunchtime, the first signs of the coming storm finally reached the dorm. The unexpected announcement. A correction officer walked into the unit holding a clipboard. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't mad. He just looked serious. He shouted, "Listen up. Kitchen staff rotation is changing effective immediately. Some inmates assigned to kitchen duty are being moved." Instantly, the dorm went quiet. Inmates looked at each other. Dre whispered, "Oh, so something's really happening." Boston nodded slowly. "They don't switch the whole kitchen unless they found something bad." Rico sat up straighter, paying close attention. The officer continued, "If your name is called, pack your property. You're changing assignments." He started reading names, and one stood out. Tito Hernandez. The entire dorm reacted at once. "Yo, that's the kitchen dude. He got hit. What did he do?" But nobody knew the truth yet. All they knew was that something big had shifted. The rumors begin. In Rikers, rumors travel faster than food carts. By the afternoon, inmates were saying everything from, "They found spoiled meat." Someone was relabeling boxes. "The freezer went out days ago." The kitchen workers weren't following rules. "The food company is being investigated." Rico listened quietly. He wasn't the type to believe every rumor, but deep down he wondered, was yesterday's tray part of something bigger? Boston sat beside him and said, "You see how one bad meal can move the whole island? That's why food is no joke in here." Rico nodded. "Yeah, and imagine how many times we ate stuff like that without knowing." They both fell silent. Because that thought was scary. The effect on the new trays. When dinner trays arrived, the difference was obvious again. The rice didn't look clumpy. The vegetables looked fresher. The chicken smelled normal. Nothing looked spoiled, raw, or mushy. The officer told them, "Kitchen's under review. Expect better quality for now." "For now?" Dre repeated. "What that mean? They gonna go back to the old stuff?" The officer shrugged. "Depends what the investigation finds." That sentence stuck in everyone's mind. Because depends, in Rikers usually means things can go two ways. Better, if the kitchen fixes everything. Worse, if they try to cut corners again. And inmates know something officers rarely say out loud. When food quality drops, trouble rises. Richo's feeling. Rico took a bite of the chicken. It tasted okay, not great, not special, but okay. But he couldn't stop thinking about yesterday. The smell. The anger. The tension. The way the entire dorm almost exploded over a single tray. He thought, if that meat was bad, what else has been bad? For how long? It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. And he wasn't the only one thinking like that. Boston leaned over and said, "This ain't over, Rico. Investigations take time. People blame each other. Changes come slow." Rico nodded. But before he could respond, something happened that made the entire dorm look up. An officer hurried down the hallway shouting to another, "They just shut down Section B of the kitchen. Get ready for delays." The dorm looked at each other. Shutdown? Delays? What was going on in Section B? And what did that mean for the next meal? The kitchen shut down. The second those words echoed down the hallway, they just shut down Section B of the kitchen. The entire dorm froze. Food delays in Rikers are not a small thing. Meals run on tight schedules. Any disruption sends a ripple across the whole island. Boston glanced at Rico. Section B is where they prep the meat. Rico raised his eyebrows. So the problem really was the meat? Boston nodded slowly. Looks like it. Dre, sitting on the lower bunk nearby, muttered, "Man, if they shutting down whole sections, something big is happening." The whispers spread. It didn't take long before every inmate in Dorm 4C was whispering about the shutdown. Some said the freezer wasn't working. Some claimed spoiled boxes were found. Others said the inspector wrote up multiple violations. But one rumor hit harder than the rest. They tossed out a whole rack of trays this morning. That meant wasted food, missing meals, and a kitchen scrambling to catch up. Rico rubbed his forehead. So what's gonna happen tonight? No dinner? Dre shrugged. Bro, this is Rikers. They'll serve something. Might not be good, but they'll serve it. The bad part? He was right. Inside the kitchen. Meanwhile, the kitchen was chaos. Workers were sweeping, cleaning, scrubbing, trying to fix things quickly. Officers were taking photos. A supervisor was shouting about logs and temperatures. Tito, the inmate cook removed earlier, sat in a holding area waiting to be transported to another unit. He felt partly relieved and partly angry. Relieved because he wouldn't be blamed. Angry because now the kitchen crew was falling apart. He whispered to himself, if they shut Section B, dinner's gonna be late. Real late. And it was. Back in the dorm, the wait begins. As hours passed, inmates kept checking the clock. Dinner usually came around 4:45 or 5 p.m. But this time, nothing. 5:10 p.m., nothing. 5:25 p.m., nothing. 5:40 p.m., still nothing. Hunger began creeping in. The mood shifted. Dre stood up. Yo, this ain't funny. They gotta feed us. Another inmate shouted toward the officer's desk. Officer, when's dinner coming? The officer looked annoyed but honest. Kitchen is backed up. They'll bring trays when they can. When they can, someone repeated angrily. Rico exhaled deeply. The delay was making people restless, again. Boston stood up and raised his hands. Listen, y'all want to get riled up and start something? Because that's what happens when dinner is late. The dorm quieted down. They all remembered yesterday. No one wanted that again. But hunger has a way of pushing patience to its limit. The cart arrives. Finally, at 6:03 p.m., the metal door buzzed open. Everyone turned. A cart rolled in, but something was different. The trays were covered in plastic wrap. The officer pushing the cart looked frustrated and tired. He shouted, "Dinner trays. Step forward." Inmates lined up quickly. Rico grabbed his tray first and paused. It wasn't hot. It wasn't fresh. It wasn't spoiled, but it clearly wasn't cooked in the main kitchen. It looked like an emergency meal. Inside the tray was a cold peanut butter sandwich, a carton of milk, a small packet of cookies, an apple. Dre stared into his tray and shook his head. We waited all that time for a school lunch? Boston sighed. It's better than yesterday's disaster. Rico sat down, opened the sandwich, and took a bite. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't dinner either. He looked around the dorm and noticed something. No one was yelling. No one was threatening. No one was fighting. Everyone was tired, hungry, but calm. Because deep down, everyone knew. A kitchen shutdown is bigger than one bad tray. It means something is really wrong behind the scenes. And whatever was happening, it wasn't over. Not even close. What the investigators discovered. The next morning, the dorm woke up to the usual loud buzz of the door and the officer yelling, "Breakfast trays. Let's go." But something felt off. The officers looked tense. The food carts looked half full. And the unit felt colder, quieter, like everyone sensed the storm was getting closer. Rico rubbed his eyes, sat up, and braced himself for whatever was coming. Breakfast trays were passed out, and they were decent again. Warm oatmeal, banana, bread. Not special, but not dangerous. Still, nobody talked much. Everyone remembered the late dinner. Everyone felt the shift happening across the island. The news that spread through Rikers. Around 10:15 a.m., an officer whispered something to another guard at the desk. Rico couldn't hear everything, but he caught one sentence clearly. Health inspectors found violations. That was enough to spark whispers across the entire dorm. Dre immediately said, "Violations? Like what, rats? Spoiled meat? Mold?" Boston held up a hand. "Don't assume. Let's hear what's real." But more pieces of information kept trickling in. Freezers weren't staying cold. Some food storage logs were missing. Meat wasn't checked properly. Expired items were mixed with fresh stuff. A delivery truck reported the kitchen refused a shipment. Bags of vegetables were found rotting in a corner. Inmates listened carefully, trading bits of information like currency. For the first time, they weren't angry. They were worried. Because bad food isn't just nasty, it's dangerous. It can make hundreds of inmates sick in one day. It can spark fights. It can push people past their breaking point. The official notice. Right before lunch, the dorm officer stood up and made an announcement. Listen up. Section B of the kitchen is closed until further notice. Food will be limited for the next few days. Emergency meal plans are in effect. The dorm reacted instantly. You serious? Bro, what's emergency meals? This gonna be like yesterday? We ain't eating sandwiches forever. The officer raised a hand. I don't make the rules. The kitchen is under investigation. This applies to the whole facility. Even Boston looked troubled. This is gonna be rough, he said quietly. Rico leaned back on his bunk, thinking. If the kitchen is shut down, what are we eating next week? Next month? Because in jail, food isn't just food. Food is routine. Food is structure. Food is one of the only things inmates can count on every day. But now, even that was unstable. Inside the admin office, while lunch trays were being delivered, the investigators met with the warden. They shared everything they found. Faulty temperature controls. Mishandled meat. Poor cleaning habits. Lack of supervision. Incomplete training for inmate cooks. Improper labeling. Broken equipment. Unsanitary conditions. The warden's face was tight with frustration. How long will it take to fix? He asked. The lead inspector replied. Depends how deep the problem goes. But we can't reopen Section B until we're sure no one gets sick. That meant delays. Scrambled shifts. More temporary meals. More stress on inmates and officers. And everyone knew. Tension in Rikers can rise fast when structure falls apart. Back in the dorm, lunch arrives. The lunch tray was the same emergency-type meal. Peanut butter sandwich. Apple juice. Crackers. Rico sighed. PB&J again? Dre replied. Bro, we in survival mode now. Boston took a bite of his sandwich and said calmly. Better a cold sandwich than bad meat. He wasn't wrong. But still, everyone felt uneasy. The room was filled with quiet chewing and quiet thoughts. Richo's realization. Rico finally understood something important. Yesterday's almost riot wasn't just anger. It was a warning sign. And now that the kitchen investigation was real, this situation could go in two very different directions. Direction A. Fix the kitchen, fix the food, calm the inmates. Direction B. More shutdowns, worse meals, rising frustration, and pressure that could explode again. Rico stared at his tray. Which way will this go? Is this just the beginning? Or will it finally make things better? Nobody knew. But one thing was becoming clear. The food crisis in Rikers Island was far from over. When the island starts to feel the pressure. By the time afternoon rolled around, everyone in Rikers Island felt it. The shift, the pressure, the uneasy quiet that comes when something big changes behind closed doors. Rico sat on his bunk, staring at the wall. Every inmate around him moved slower, talked less, watched the officers more carefully. Food wasn't just food anymore. It had turned into something bigger. A system problem. A safety issue. A spark waiting for the wrong moment to burn. The first sign of trouble. Around 2 p.m., the officer at the podium got a radio call. His expression tightened as he listened. Then he said, All inmates remain in your dorms. No movement until further notice. The dorm reacted instantly. What happened? Why lockdown? Is it the kitchen? Yo, they hiding something. The officer shot back. I said stay calm. But stay calm is the hardest rule in Rikers. Word began spreading fast. Another dorm complained about breakfast. A few inmates refused trays. A housing unit started shouting at officers. Tension was rising all across the island. All because of one thing. Food. When something affects thousands of people in one place, even small problems grow fast. Inside the control room, Upstairs, the control room was buzzing. Maps of the dorms lit up. Officers were on the phone. Supervisors walked back and forth. The deputy warden looked at the screen and asked, "Which units are agitated?" A sergeant replied, 4A, 4C, 3D, and 5B is getting loud. "Because of food?" the deputy warden asked. The sergeant nodded. "They're tired of emergency meals. They want real trays." The deputy sighed. "Kitchen says it'll take 3 days to reopen Section B. 3 days of cold meals is going to make the inmates restless." Restless was an understatement. In Rikers, 3 days can feel like 30. Back in the dorm, the waiting game. The most dangerous thing in jail isn't violence. It isn't gangs. It isn't even officers. It's waiting with nothing to do. Waiting builds frustration. Frustration builds tension. Tension becomes anger. And anger becomes action. Rico watched Dre pacing near the phones. Boston sat quietly, deep in thought. You could feel it in the room. Everyone was trying to stay calm, but everyone was on edge. Then finally, movement returned. The officer called out, "Dinner is coming." But nobody cheered. Nobody smiled. Everyone braced themselves. Dinner trays arrive, and something is different. The trays were passed out quickly. Most inmates already expected the same emergency sandwich. But when Rico opened his tray, his eyebrows shot up. Inside was something new. A boiled potato. Rice shaped into a scoop. A small portion of beans. Bread. And a carton of milk. It wasn't hot, but it wasn't cold either. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't spoiled. It was a transition meal. Something the backup kitchens put together when the main kitchen is down. Dre poked his potato with a plastic spork. "It looks edible?" Boston nodded. "They must have opened another section of the kitchen." The officer confirmed it as he walked by. "They're using the admin building kitchen for now. Smaller space. Limited recipes." Inmate after inmate silently accepted the truth. This is what dinner will look like until the investigation ends. But then something unexpected happened. Right after dinner, the officer made another announcement. "All dorms will receive an additional snack tonight. This is from the administration." The dorm reacted instantly. "Extra snacks? Why? What they trying to do?" Boston smiled knowingly. "That's a peace offering," he said. "When stuff gets tense, they try to calm the island." Rico nodded slowly. It made sense. Better food equals calmer inmates. Calmer inmates equals safer officers. Safer officers equals fewer problems. But the question remained, would a few extra snacks fix a bigger problem? Because the kitchen was still shut down. The investigation was still running. And the inmates were still watching closely. This wasn't the end of the food crisis. Not even close. When food becomes a voice. As night fell over Rikers Island, Dorm 4C finally went quiet. Men lay on their bunks, the lights dimmed, each prisoner thinking about the same thing. How something as simple as food revealed everything about life inside these walls. The spoiled tray. The rising anger. The tension that almost cracked the dorm. The investigation that spread through the island like wildfire. The kitchen shut down. The emergency meals. The fear. The frustration. The hunger. The unity. The silence. All of it started with one tray. But behind that tray was a bigger story. A story about survival, about dignity, and about what inmates face every single day in a place built to break them. Because in Rikers Island, food isn't just food. Food is communication. Food is respect. Food is danger. Food is control. Sometimes, food is the only thing inmates feel they can fight for. Rico learned that. Boston knew it all along. Dre felt it. And every inmate who touched a tray that week understood the truth. When meals go wrong, everything goes wrong. When meals improve, hope returns. And when the system listens, even a little, the whole island breathes easier. The kitchen will reopen. The investigation will end. The trays will change again, for better or worse. But one thing will never change. Inside Rikers Island, every meal tells a story. A story of how hard it is to survive. A story of how inmates navigate pressure, hunger, conflict, and control. A story of how small changes can shift the entire mood of an overcrowded, stressed-out jail. And the next time a tray slides across the floor, the next time an inmate takes a bite, the next time someone whispers, "Is this safe?" It won't just be about hunger. It'll be about everything they've lived through. The struggle, the frustration, the fear, the unity, and the hope, fragile but still alive, that things might get better. Rikers Island is one of the harshest jails in the world. But even here, one truth stays the same. When people are fed right, they fight less. When they fight less, they survive more. And in a place like this, survival is everything. This is the story of prison food in Rikers Island. A story that shows the power of a tray, and the people who live behind it.